Yes, we do have a quorum, so we are in good shape. So today's
Point of order, Mr. Mayor.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I just got a text from Mike Farmer. He has no number to get into the meeting.
Okay, it got emailed to all of us, so he should have the agenda along with Zoom phone number and account number.
I don't know if he has access to. I don't know if his internet is working or what. He just texted me. He has no number.
Okay.
I texted him earlier this morning.
Thank you, Jackie. Okay, we'll go ahead and move forward then. If he joins us, we'll go ahead and add him to the roll call. If not, we'll just he'll call in and we'll fill him in afterwards. Okay, this is the city's 10th council meeting held via online conferencing application. All city council members and city staff are participating from remote locations. Please allow one person to speak at a time. I will call on every member to make sure you have had an opportunity to ask questions. I will now ask the city clerk to start a roll call, please.
Mayor Guerrero.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Stremler.
Here.
Councilor Farmer. Councilor Henry.
Here.
Councilor Restucci. Councilor Hicks.
Here.
Councilor Broersma. City Manager Casey.
Here.
City Clerk Renteria, I am here. Finance Director Alba.
Here.
Fire Chief Anderson. I know he's here. Fire Chief Anderson.
Here.
Police Chief Escalera.
He's on leave today, and sitting in for him is Commander Scott Bailey.
Commander Bailey. Commander Bailey. Public Works Director Fisher. Public Works Director Fisher.
Here.
Okay. All righty. So we have Councilor Farmer, Councilor Restucci, Councilor Broersma, not here at the moment. And for staff, we are not sure if Commander Bailey's here or not. I have one person that's a guest, and I'm not sure.
Jackie?
Yes?
Did you hear me when I said I was here?
No.
Okay, so it wasn't unmuting when it was supposed to. Sorry about that.
And then I had you down as Shane. So I wonder. Okay, so you're here. Great. Okay.
Okay, so we're short Restucci and Farmer, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so hopefully they're able to join us. If not, before the meeting is over, we'll try to remember to see if we want to give an excused absence, because I did not receive an email. I'm not sure if the city manager or our city clerk received an email.
I did not receive an email from Councilor Restucci, and it sounds like the clerk had texted Councilor Farmer earlier today.
Okay. All right, thank you. So we'll move on to our active agenda, which is parking and vehicle ordinance discussion with attorney. Again, this is for discussion only, and we'll have our city manager give us an intro into this.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of council. This is an update and some further information in response to the legal landscape that governs how cities can regulate homelessness and activities associated with vehicles and parking and other activities in light of current case law. Part of the prompting for this discussion was the presence of a small group of vehicles in a city-owned parking lot downtown. I shared late last week with council, and just for the record, among the other activities that the city has been taking in trying to manage the circumstances there, in addition to increased police patrols, engagement by code enforcement, and continued monitoring of that, I also had reached out to an organization which the city of Sunnyside is a member of, the Homeless Network of Yakima County, and sought their assistance in connecting these individuals with any programs or resources that might be available to them. Their neighborhood health services organization, their outreach team, made contact with the individuals last week, and privacy laws prevent them from providing specific case updates going forward, but they are currently working with the residents on permanent housing solutions and entering them into their coordinated data entry system. Once they're completed through the intake process, it'll take a few days to get sorted out through that, but they will be working to try to match them with various funding streams to assist them with both vehicle repairs and housing. But that addresses a particular circumstance, not necessarily the broader issues and some of the concerns with limitations or factors in our current codes that may not have reflected the most current case law. And so Attorney Eric Ferguson, city's attorney, will be walking the council through both current case law and some potential ordinance language that will help equip the city with further tools for addressing these situations going forward. With that, I'll turn it over to the city attorney.
Great. Can you hear me okay? Great. Okay. Jackie, how did you want to do the slides? Did you just want me to say next slide, or how did you want to handle that?
I can make you co-host and you can drive, or you can tell me next slide, whatever you prefer.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't want to be trusted with that level of responsibility. So no, I appreciate if you could help me out there.
Okay.
Great. Yeah. So next slide there.
And just so everybody knows, Commander Bailey is on the phone with us. He just was muted.
Jackie.
Counselor Farmer, is that you?
I'm on.
Actually, okay, so that's Counselor Farmer. Okay, let's see. Commander Bailey, are you somewhere out there?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Okay, Eric, I'm ready.
Okay, sounds great. All right, so yeah, just wanted to kind of go over some of the larger kind of legal landscape to kind of make some sense of it. I'll tell you the kind of let the ending, first, just so that you can kind of track along. There are no black and white, silver bullet kind of answers that we're going to get to at the end of this. So, but I think we'll have a lot better idea about what kind of the landscape that we're kind of stuck dealing with right now while things are in flux. But we'll certainly try to make some sense out of the ones that the few things that we do know. We'll try to make sure we communicate that. So just a little bit of an outline of what we're going to go over tonight. We'll go over briefly the kind of the initial starting point of homelessness and can it be criminalized, and then we'll go over some of the issues that we're currently kind of facing, and then the legal considerations. I will do my absolute best to make those cases as interesting as possible and brief for our purposes. And then we'll do a little bit, touch on where we're currently at with our current legal landscape, and then talk about some potential other policy options, and then what other regulations might be able to be pushed forward, and then we can discuss and hopefully answer some questions. Next slide. Okay, so just kind of as a starting point, you know, the idea that folks are like, well, you know, one of the questions has become kind of a hot topic about, you know, criminalizing homelessness, and that's kind of a that's kind of a misnomer. I think you know, it's not that. That's a very I guess generalized question. The parts that because I don't think that's the there's no actual. I'm not aware of any particular statute that particularly outlaws being homeless. It's more of a question of are there certain regulations that essentially have an effect what we would like to refer to the law as an as applied effect. So even though something may be constitutionally on its face constitutional, it may be in its application disproportionate and somehow violate a constitutional requirement. The most recent, I guess, hot topic on this was the Ninth Circuit case, the Martin v. Boise case, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But essentially, what that brought into play was this concept of the Eighth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which I'm sure we're all up to speed on, but it's the Eighth Amendment deals with the reasonableness of bail, as well as the cruel and unusual punishments clause, which is what specifically the Martin v. Boise case dealt with. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then the city does not currently, because of the recent Ninth Circuit, which is what the circuit that we're in, no city in the Ninth Circuit has the ability to override that ruling, obviously. So they have to implement it as it currently stands. Sorry, Jackie, just slide there. Okay, so issue statement. This is just kind of some of the issues that we're dealing with here. The number of homeless individuals that are sleeping in vehicles related to the 7th Street parking lot and other parking lots that have kind of become a topic of conversation. The current city codes regulating vehicles and parking that don't really completely address the situation. We've got SMC 828020, which talks about abandoned vehicles and what those kind of constraints would be. And then we have SMC 1008-160, which deals with any vehicle that is repeatedly parking that in a particular place outside of the established time zone, that could be declared a public nuisance. And then that kicks in some of the other provisions related to being able to then cite the vehicle, and then if the fine goes unpaid, to be able to remove the vehicle and have it impounded. So those are specifically related to vehicles, because the issue that we're referring to specifically is related to folks that have been sleeping and staying in vehicles. And so that's kind of the framework that we currently have in our code. Next slide there, Jackie. Thank you. So Martin v. Boise, just real quick, and I'll tell you, it is an extremely complicated case. It is very narrow, but it deals with a lot of nuanced issues in the federal constitutional scheme. But at the end of the day, the biggest takeaway that has the largest effect on local government is the idea that enforcement of ordinances that prohibit sleeping, sitting, or lying on all, and I underlined all for a reason, you'll see in just a second, public property is unconstitutional when homeless individuals do not have a meaningful alternative. We talked a little bit about that last time about what a meaningful alternative would be, but we'll talk a little more about it tonight. But meaningful alternative would include, or at a minimum would include, but are not limited to, shelter space or a legal place to sleep. And that's the real key phrase there, legal place to sleep, because that can really be extremely broad. So then finally, essentially an ordinance is unconstitutional, and this is kind of the gist of Martin. If it, quote, punishes a person for lacking the ability or the means to live out the universal and unavoidable consequences of being human. And so that was the real difficult part about it, is that really is not a limited, a lot of folks, when the decision first was handed down, a lot of folks were worried that that is a very broad, I guess, assertion in the case that could very easily be expanded to other areas. So, but we can talk a little bit about that in just a second. I'm sorry, the next slide there, Jackie. So the other things that it talked about and how it kind of relates to for our purposes is that homeless individuals may not be cited for merely sleeping in the lot if there is no meaningful alternative. However, the Ninth Circuit did affirm that a city may bar the use or erection of structures such as tents. They did not elaborate as to what those structures may be, so it's unclear whether those would include a vehicle. And then specifically, if a city desires to prohibit sleeping citywide, the Ninth Circuit held that on public property. That is, the Ninth Circuit held that the city must also include a provision that would suspend enforcement if there's no meaningful alternative for somebody to be able to sleep. So essentially what this means, and I'll try to make some of this make sense, essentially what it comes down to is the city of Boise was enforcing a camping ordinance citywide, and in the definition of camping was the act of sleeping. So what has happened, and we're seeing a lot of now, is essentially a conflation of those two concepts. And the case is much more narrow, I think, than people initially thought. Initially, people felt that it meant that all camping ordinances were going to be unconstitutional, and that is certainly not the case. Camping, if it does not, if it deals specifically with structures and facilities, camping facilities and camping paraphernalia, and doesn't essentially outlaw in and of itself sleeping, then it could very well pass constitutional muster. There's a rarely do these cases, do the footnotes in these cases, really mean much. But in this particular case, there's a particular footnote called footnote 8 that's gotten quite a bit of press and notoriety because it really kind of lays out exactly what the court was getting at. I'll read this quote to you real quick just so that we kind of have some context. But basically, the judge who was drafting this was coming out and saying that she felt that there were she was narrowing the holding through this footnote. And the quote is, even where shelter is unavailable, an ordinance prohibiting sleeping, lying, or sleeping outside at particular times or in particular locations might well be constitutionally permissible. So too might an ordinance barring the obstruction of public rights of way or the erection of certain structures. Whether, this is the key part, whether some other ordinance is consistent with the 8th Amendment will depend, as here, on whether it punishes a person for lacking the means to live out the, quote, universal and unavoidable consequences of being human in the way the ordinance prescribes. So what that really meant is that the way that the city of Boise had drafted their camping ordinance, it was essentially an anti-sleeping ordinance. So those two have been a little bit, that's muddied the water quite a bit with regard to these ordinances. So next slide, check it, please. So the next case we just want to talk about a little bit, and we'll try to bring all these three different kind of concepts together. But the next case is the Seattle versus Long case, and that's a 2020 decision out of the Washington Court of Division 1. Division 1 is from, I believe it's I-90 North, and then I think I-90 South is Division 2, or maybe even the Pierce County line. I'm not sure exactly. I can't remember. I've been over here long enough now. I've forgotten where the line is. Long and short of it is, it's neither one of those is us. We are in the Division 3, which is essentially Cascades East. So this current decision is not binding on us, but it did really cause a stir because it is a new interpretation of some longstanding laws. So the first point is that it made clear that a homestead, quote, homestead, can consist of both real and personal property that an owner uses as a residence. One of the things that, and I won't give you a history lesson on this, but one of the things that happened, about 100 or so years, almost 150 now, courts or constitutions, and as well as a lot of statutes were drafted to prevent people from, through debt, losing their homestead, and they were in fact actual homesteads at the time. So that's where a lot of these laws and constitutional protections come from, the idea of a homestead. That's now obviously been expanded to people's actual physical homes, but then also personal property that they use in the ability to use that home. So, and the legislature added that additional personal property back in the 1960s, I believe. So there's little doubt that homestead under our current statute or statutory regime includes personal property if it's, as long as it's being used in concert with being a residence. Now, the second point was that an individual residing in a vehicle has homestead rights in the vehicle. So One of the things in this particular case that was interesting is that a gentleman had been using a truck as a I guess a residence or legal or as a some kind of shelter, and was parking it in a particular place. The vehicle had been cited for 72 hour, told that it was going to be towed in 72 hours. It was towed, impounded because it violated the Seattle Municipal Code. It was towed to a lot, and then in order to get the vehicle out of impound, Mr. Long had to agree to a payment plan. But the concept was that it was under this threat of a forced sale, that the vehicle was going to be sold if the impound fees and storage fees weren't paid, or at least agreed to in a payment plan. So homestead rights protect a person's residence and essential possessions from enforcement of judgment liens, including the forced sale of the vehicle to towing and impound costs. That's what the decision held. I'm not saying that that is settled law and by any stretch, but essentially that's the takeaway from the case, was that both King County Superior Court as well as then the Court of Appeals Division 1 determined that if the person was using the vehicle, that clearly was personal property. They were using it as a residence. Therefore, it's a homestead and it's entitled to the same protections under the homestead rights as a regular house would be, which is under those protections. It's not that there can't be judgments and liens placed against it. It's that they cannot attach in a way that would require a quote forced sale. And so that's really the prong that the court took really focused on, and said that the legislature, while they had a couple of different, they had some conflicting statutes, they believed that because the legislature put in the provisions for homestead regulations, that they were to be interpreted liberally. They were decided that that was a more, I guess, accurate interpretation. Sorry, Jackie, next slide. Just again, while not currently binding on the city of Seattle, because obviously Sunnyside's in Division 3, if it was applied to Sunnyside in its current form, in other words, if it went up to the Supreme Court and became law of the state of Washington, the homeless, in this particular case, homeless individuals living in lots likely would have homestead rights in those vehicles. Impound cost would be allowed to be assessed, but the threat of a forced sale would be problematic if this case went on a trajectory to be approved for the state. And then currently there's no prohibition on impounding the vehicles, but the city would have a difficult time recouping any of those impound costs. So just the little bit of the, Jackie, the next slide, please. The little bit of the other side of the coin is, well, because that sounds pretty straightforward. It doesn't sound like that's really up for interpretation if the way the court's decided it. And that's, as obviously we all know, that's only part of it. The other part of it really comes down to what was the city of Seattle arguing if it's so clear. One of the things that they really focused on was the fact that not only in there's two conflicting provisions inside of the homestead provisions of the RCW. So there's two actual RCWs that conflict, that are fairly close to each other, and don't seem to make sense if they're applied as read. That's problem one. The other problem is that there's clearly the law is extremely clear with regard to the ability of tow companies to be able to, once they go forward and are able to tow vehicles that have been impounded, that their remedy is that they are able to potentially force the sale if those fees aren't paid, and that's clear in the statute. So it would be interesting if a different court took a look at it. It's not clear yet how that would play out. To me, in reading it and trying to apply it, it looks a little murky. So it will be interesting to see if Seattle. We currently don't know whether Seattle's going to appeal, because this is so recent. They have not run the limitation on being able to decide whether they're going to appeal this to the Supreme Court or attempt to appeal it. But yeah, there clearly is two sides to the argument, and Seattle's argument is pretty plain that they're not objecting to the fact that the vehicle was potentially used, was personal property that was used as a homestead. What they're saying is that if you're going to do that, you have to declare it. There's a legal process that you go through for getting a declaration of property that's being personal property that's being used as a homestead. There's a process for that. And essentially what the court is saying is the legislature clearly intended to include vehicles as personal property under homestead law, and going that extra step to declare it wouldn't make sense based on the other portions of the law. Seattle said argument is that, well, if that's the case, it's going to make anyone who potentially or who has their vehicle impounded could assert that they were using that as a residence or that it was part of their homestead, and then the city wouldn't be able to move forward on forcing a sale for folks who can't pay those tow fees for impounding. So the long and short of it is you can still impound vehicles. They're not saying that the impound laws are in and of themselves unconstitutional. Rather, what they're saying is that if you're going to, I guess, withhold that property for under the threat of a forced sale of that property, then you're in violation of the homestead. Next slide. So the next case, just real quick, we'll talk about is Levan versus Los Angeles. This was a case that really dealt with property interest in property that is in essence illegally on someone else's property or being used for camping. And this dealt with the city of Los Angeles was going through after placing notification that these items were going to be removed, would go through, remove these items, and then if they were left there, they would be destroyed at that time. The court came back and said that the Ninth Circuit as well, in this case, said, no, there is a property interest in this property. Just because the person might not actually be there, it may be unattended, doesn't mean that it still doesn't have a valid property interest, and that you need, if that's the case, then you need to go through all the due process steps that we would go through for any other property interest, which would require advance notice of it being removed, which is why we obviously have to give 72 hours before we do remove vehicles that have been abandoned. Then you need to store this personal property for a period of time, a reasonable period of time, so that folks could have an ability to contest the impounding of it, as well as be able to redeem it. And so a lot of folks have kind of floated around different levels of time, 90 days versus 60 days. And nobody really knows because there is no clear decision on what a quote reasonable amount of time to retain this property would be. The next point that really kind of dealt with it was who the city of Los Angeles was paying to remove this property. If it's city staff, obviously training and equipment that are required, and liability is an issue that you always want to be mindful of. But then obviously a contracted vendor, it would have to be clear contract terms and conditions to make sure that they were doing that according to the law, not necessarily according to a private sector kind of standard that may not apply to them. Next slide, please. So now bringing that back a little bit to our situation, potential actions consistent with Martin v. Boise. Community and faith-based initiatives that might create shelter space to deal on private or religious property, that's obviously a potential action. Another one could be that the city would be able to identify places where sitting, lying, and sleeping would be allowed. Then finally, the city may suspend enforcement of prohibitions when there would be no meaningful alternative. I'll talk probably the most about the second one there, because one of the things that has been kind of misinterpreted in all of this is this idea that either on the one hand, you cannot ban sleeping, sitting, or lying in a city. That's not true. You absolutely can. You can't ban sitting, lying, or sleeping anywhere on public property, which would include both parks and right-of-ways, as well as at all times. And so that's really the key there, is that Boise's ordinance truly was that specific in that it really banned the ability to sleep on any public property anywhere in the city at all times. So one of the ways that you can obviously ameliorate that condition by saying that certain portions of the city right of ways, it's not illegal to sleep on those. That still doesn't mean that folks would be able to set up encampments, as we discussed previously. That's a different concept. The other portion would be that you could say, okay, well, you can't sleep anywhere during these periods of time. That would be another way to address it. Or finally, you could say that you can't sleep anywhere at any time in the city on any public property, but we'll suspend the enforcement of that unless there's no meaningful alternative available. So, and the problem with that obvious option is that currently none of those sites or any of those options really exist in or near the city of Sunnyside. Next slide, please. So policy options, ordinance changes. Obviously, that's something that we can look at. It's a matter of careful drafting to make sure that it meets the need that the council's trying to set with that policy. Currently, we have SMC 828 and SMC 1008, both penalties for impoundment of vehicles, and provide that due process and take reasonable care to collect and store the personal belongings. Another ordinance change, so we could modify those in a way that would actually really more closely deal with the specific issue that the city is currently facing. Second way is that update city parking ordinances to address vehicles that are being used for habitation, and or create a new code section that specifically deals with vehicle camping on public property. And so, I think what we're seeing is kind of the limitations on what our current problem is with what the legal options that we currently have. This is really kind of falling in the middle of that, and so these would be ways to attempt to try to kind of narrow that down so that the city would have a formal policy on dealing with this. It's really kind of brought to light the limitations that we currently have. Next slide, please. So regulating vehicle, that third option, regulating vehicle camping, Exhibit A, which was a draft ordinance that we put together that might be one of the options that the city considers to be able to address the issue. It was largely taken from Union Gap, which they've attempted to address vehicle camping through local regulation, taking into consideration the previous cases. Ordinances that define and restrict camping provide the mechanism to clean up and removal of unauthorized vehicle encampments and set penalties for violations as well. But clearly would need to take into account some of the things that we previously mentioned with regard to the other cases that could be in the offing. Enforcement, sorry, next slide, Jackie, please. Regulating, or suggested language, enforcement suspension. This would be a potential way that we could craft something that would make sure that if there's shelter unavailable, that it would be able to still be able to be consistent with the law. So, for example, we would say something like except or as otherwise provided in the section. Enforcement of provisions of this chapter shall be suspended for persons who are indigent and homeless anytime there is no space or beds available in reasonable, accessible homeless shelters to the extent such available space is required by law. So that obviously means that obviously, if still required by law, we would be able to suspend enforcement of that. So with that, I believe we're on to our last slide there, Jackie. So yeah, discussion and questions. Sorry, I know that was a lot of information fast, and so please let me know if there's any questions I can answer and want to clarify for everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. It's good presentation. I'll go ahead and call on each council member to see if they have any questions or comments on this presentation. And our first person will be our Councilor Farmer.
There's a lot of information that was just given to us, and it's my thoughts would be is I think we need to go forward somehow and draft some kind of an ordinance that we could have control over what happens in our parking lots and in our parks. It looks to me like there are, from what I understand, that there are some ways that we probably could do that, at least make it better than what it is, even if we had to designate a certain area of the city as that place. Maybe we could do that, but I think that the rights of the citizens who live next to this are every bit as valuable as the rights to the people who are trying to camp there. I would like to see us move forward in some fashion as to limit and regulate what can go on in our parking lots, and that's kind of my thought.
Okay. Up next, we have Councilor Restucci.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. At this time, I don't have any questions for city staff or the attorney. I appreciate the briefing that we received. I'm kind of ambivalent right now, Mr. Mayor, as to whether or not we move forward. But listening to Mr. Farmer's comments, I'm willing to continue to take this forward and have a discussion and debate and take a look at some type of ordinance or solution. But at this point, I'm not ready to comment on what we received tonight.
Thank you. Up next, we have Councilor Henry.
Thank you. I also would like to appreciate my gratitude for you giving us all that information.
Sure.
I also don't have any comments for what was said exactly, but I do agree with Farmer on one thing, and that is I believe we need to have a place or a designated area for this to happen. And I don't know if we can make it for a certain amount of time or this and that, or maybe put some sort of porta potty out there. You know, I don't know exactly, but I do believe we need a place for homeless because we have nothing. Everyone knows that. We can't just sit in the top of it. This is our problem. Truth is, if you travel around Washington, this is a Washington problem. Okay, we are very fortunate to have such a small amount of this problem in our area, and I feel like as a community we can deal with it. So that's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Deputy Mayor Stremler.
I just had a question more than anything. It's my understanding that some of these cars are not even being used as sleeping quarters lately because of the heat. Does anybody know if that's true, and does that make any difference?
Mr. Casey, would you know the answer to that?
We've heard some reports that the residents of the vehicles have left them for brief periods of time. They haven't abandoned them, to our knowledge. They still return to them periodically, and with the heat subsiding, they seem to return. Whether that would make a difference in being able to consider them abandoned when their use is pretty well established, I'd have to leave that question to the attorneys.
Yeah, no, I think one of the things that we really found when we started to get into this, and to Mr. Farmer's point there, I think said it best, which is really, it's almost like we have too much of a parking ordinance to deal with vehicles being used in a homeless capacity, but we don't have enough of a camping ordinance to be able to deal with people camping in vehicles. So it is kind of a no man's land situation currently. And I think that's really one of the things that we tried to craft with the camping ordinance was limiting it to truly camping, not making it about sleeping, which really helps that issue. But at the same time, really focuses on the structures, and because this is not about someone not having the ability to physically be able to sleep anywhere in the city of Sunnyside. It's using a particular structure in a particular way, and so it focuses not on the consequence of the unavoidable action of being human. It focuses on the process that somebody may be doing something beyond that. So that's really the key, is that once we get beyond the sleeping aspect of this, then we can focus a lot more on, well, now wait a sec, this is a camp that somebody may be using to sleep, but that's not constitutionally protected. So we did, I think what we really found is that we've kind of got too much of one thing and not enough of another. And I think this what we kind of have attached is a good, safe, legal way, and I think also compassionate for everybody. I think that's it's not meant to be something that's going to solve the problem all one way or another, but it really will, I think, give the city an ability to add another tool to its tool belt legally to deal with this issue, so that, as Councilor Farmer said, that some folks' rights don't end up overriding other folks' rights, but also understanding that there are some basic human rights as well involved here. So, but anyway, yeah, so that's kind of what we've attempted to do there, Mr. Schremer.
Mr. Mayor, we didn't go over the actual draft ordinance during the main presentation, had held that. If after the rest of council has had a chance to ask their questions, if there'd be interest in walking through the structure of that ordinance, we'd be happy to do that as well for council.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Strimler, any additional questions?
That was it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Hicks.
My question is, do we get a chance to look for any city-owned plots that we could use for this, or anything in that range?
I did ask that we see if we had anything available. Most of our lots of the city-owned property are either currently in use as parks or as occupied facilities, public works activities and so forth, or are these parking lots downtown. There are some open spaces adjacent to or associated with some of these, but we haven't been able to put together kind of an evaluated inventory of which might be suitable for either vehicle or other kinds of parking, encampment. But we are continuing to work on that.
Well, and to that point, Councilor Hicks, I think one of the issues that I've seen now, having gone through a lot of this stuff, is that the way folks are really trying to deal with if they're going to allow sleeping or in some capacity somewhere in the city, there's essentially that kind of breaks off into, while that is one route to go, that kind of splinters off and breaks into a couple of different routes as well, which is the route that one of which is the route that you just mentioned, which is finding a suitable city-owned parcel, and then that invariably obviously would lead to an encampment. And some folks have said, well, we're okay with that. Let's put aside some property. Now, from a legal perspective, I'll tell you that one makes me a whole lot more nervous, because now we're starting to talk about city-owned property. We're starting to talk about getting in the business of having to regulate that piece of property, and it comes with its own set of liability concerns. That's kind of the one branch, which I'm not saying can't be done. I just think it just comes with a little more, it's going to require a little more heavy lifting to make sure we do it right. The other branch is to essentially, what I've seen a lot of other folks do, is create certain zones in their cities where it's not illegal to sleep in those particular right-of-ways. And so if somebody is then discovered or is addressed as sleeping in an area that's prohibited, they can always go to a particular area. Now, that really highlights an obvious part, which is where are you going to tell them to go? Are you going to say that certain streets in the city are sleeping approved? Those folks aren't going to be happy, right? So that's the problem. Really, and I think that really wouldn't be the way to approach it. The way to approach it would be say, okay, these are the certain areas where we don't want to allow folks to either sleep in parks or parks, let's say parks citywide, and certain right-of-ways in this zone. And that way, any other right-of-way is potentially allowed, someone is allowed to actually physically sleep there, if they had to. But that's how other folks have attempted to try to dilute. Maybe that's not the right word. I don't mean to be insensitive about it, but to really try to diffuse the amount of folks that would be in one particular location. So, but anyway, yeah, I don't want to get too far off the field there, but yeah, that is definitely an option that folks have pursued.
Yeah, because I agree with Councilor Farmer. It's not fair to the business owners to have them set up next to their business. It does hurt their business in a way. I know people will be scared to go near some of them. Some of them do have some issues, not just down on their luck, but I mean, they have other issues.
Sure.
So Hicks, in further response, just point out, and Eric included it in the presentation earlier, but in addition to the two paths, the government isn't necessarily the entity that has to or is the only one enabled to try to address this in terms of identifying a location. Community-based or faith-based organizations have certain rights under the law as well. Under a federal law, and there was a presentation at an AWC meeting here not too long ago that spoke to this. Under the Religious Land Use and Institutional Persons Act, a religious organization may host homeless people on a property owned or controlled by the religious organization, and certain and still be regulated for health and safety considerations. But that is a third pathway whereby a safe and legally authorized kind of site could come into existence, which would help with that test of, is there a meaningful or reasonable alternative for residing in or on, say, a city-owned parking lot?
Right. Did the Cornerstone Church, do they not do this anymore, or are they at full capacity, or they used to have a setup for it?
I'm not familiar with that. Be happy to check into it. What was the name of that again, sir?
Cornerstone Church. They used to have a little basement area they had set up.
We'll research that. Thank you.
Okay, any further questions, Councilor Hicks?
Nope, that's all I had.
Okay, Councilor Boersma.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. So like Mr. Farmer and Mr. Henry expressed, I think this is something that we definitely need to move forward on. We have an opportunity here to maybe get ahead of it before it becomes more of a crisis and could potentially cause greater problems. I think we need to be careful to respect both the rights of the folks who live in those encampments and the rights of the neighbors. And so if we get ahead of it now, or we get started on it now, we're going to be ahead of the situation just a little bit. What we do is more than just the one encampment that we're talking about over on 7th Street. I wasn't aware of it before, but became aware of it a week or so that we have a second encampment a little further south in town. It's not in a neighborhood or anything like that, but business owners have mentioned that they've been forced to close their bathrooms because people would come in and just leave them a horrible mess. They're using fecal matter to deface the front of the businesses, and they've got to clean up after that regularly. So we have a second encampment in town already as well. So whatever we do is going to have to have in mind that there may be more than one encampment, more than one place, and try to get ahead of that. I think using agencies that are not necessarily the government, as Mr. Casey mentioned, is potentially a very good idea. Religious organizations have been doing this sort of thing for years. I know of an organization that has talked about doing some sort of a shelter, mostly for teens in Sunnyside, but I haven't heard of anything for adults. But I do think that we need to move ahead on this.
Thank you, Councilor Boersma. So, Ms. City Manager, did you say you wanted to present the draft ordinance that we have so far for discussion?
We can, if that would be helpful to council, to just kind of walk through the structure of it. As Mr. Ferguson indicated, this was inspired in part by recently developed and adopted language out of the city of Union Gap. However, Eric's office has reviewed it and then aligned it to fit within the structure and correct references for Sunnyside City Code. And kind of take a quick walk through it. As Eric mentioned, it is intended primarily to kind of thread that needle where the city had quite a bit of number of tools related to vehicles and abandoned vehicles or unoccupied vehicles, but didn't really have anything that was specific to the notion of camping anywhere in the public spaces. So this is attempting to address that circumstance and provide some specific tools that that can be added to our toolkit. Eric,
Yeah, I can walk
you
through
want
it
to
with
jump in?
Sure.
It's pretty straightforward. It lays out where and defines unlawful camping, and then talks about storage of property, and it provides the city with some tools for enforcing against violations of the ordinance, which are substantive. So
Great. Yeah, no, I won't drag us all through each sentence. I want to keep you awake, so we'll just hit the highlights here. The biggest, one of the biggest things is the purpose. Rarely is a purpose statement as important as it would be in a situation like this, but you want to be clear. You need to be clear that why you're doing something like this, that you're clearly doing it to prevent the harm to the health and safety of the public and promote public health and safety and general welfare. So that's key, because that is a tenet of government purposes of putting together regulations under the city's police powers. So that really kind of sets the stage. Next, the definitions, again, normally are really yawners. Nobody really cares about them except in situations like this, where they really are going to make the difference in determining what something may be legal and what would be unconstitutional. Specifically, camp. I'm sorry, Jackie, if we could go back up to camp for a second there. Camp is really probably the most critical one with this particular ordinance, because the definition of to camp means to pitch, erect, or occupy camp facilities, or to use camp paraphernalia or both for the purpose of or in such a way as will facilitate remaining overnight or parking a camper, recreational vehicle, trailer, or other vehicle for the purpose of remaining overnight. So the key is that camp doesn't mean sleep. Camp means using either camp facilities, camp paraphernalia, or these other items to remain overnight. So it doesn't outlaw sleeping, and it really focuses on the method that somebody might be using beyond sleeping. So that's really what the focus is. Camp facilities is obviously defined as tents and shelters and those types of things. Also recreational vehicles and trailers. One of the things that we may want to do is potentially add vehicles, other vehicles to that might not be a bad idea for kind of a belt and suspenders approach. And then obviously camp paraphernalia deals with all the stuff that comes with facilities. Now, I will say this, part of camp paraphernalia is a little concerning. We may want to look a little more into that, because you could be there. The Martin v. Boise case specifically talked about how it was not just if somebody was attempting to sleep, they had to be able to do that in a essentially realistic way. You couldn't just arrest someone for sleeping. Oh, well, they had camp paraphernalia, which was a sleeping bag in the middle of winter. That's going to be problematic. So we want to be really precise with that and how that's applied. Next page, please.
And Eric, while you're advancing, I'll point out one of the things that we noted in the way Union Gap approached this is it wasn't so narrow as to address only the circumstance or the types of circumstances that we might encounter in a city-owned parking lot, but it was designed to address the full scope of camping activity to include, for example, the kinds of situations that Councilor Boersma just described.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and then park is pretty straightforward. It's pretty all-inclusive, and then personal property. That's pretty well defined. We did have to refer to right-of-way, which is defined further in our code under SMC 1624. Some of these other things that are mentioned are helpful when you get down to what kind of items would be used to camp with. A little further down, please, Jackie. So yeah, so then unauthorized encampment means two or more camp facilities in an identifiable area which appear to be used for the unlawful camping. For purposes of this chapter, an identified area includes areas where camp facilities are inside of each other and or areas where each camp facility is located within 300 feet. So that would be an encampment, not just someone who's particularly camping. That would be more than one, obviously. So unlawful camping is it's unlawful for a person to camp in following areas, and that would be right-of-way, trails, parks, park facilities, publicly owned lots, improved or unimproved, which is a biggie. That's been one of the things that's happened quite a bit. Is there's a lot of that's what actually was the case in the Seattle matter. There was an unimproved parcel lot that the city owned, or any public area where camping obstructs or interferes with the intended public use of the property. So that really is pretty broad in terms of what camping could be. Storage, this really deals with the storage of personal property in public spaces. So this would address that second issue that I think Councilor Stremler was addressing, which is they may not actually be being used for camping, but they could be being used for storage. So it would also include that. And then it would also go further to include unauthorized encampments, which would be obviously more than one particular camping folks to get in within 300 feet of each other. So a little further down, please, Jackie. So yeah, so this deals with the what would take place with an unauthorized encampment, which results in a significant risk prior to removing the property. The city would go through these procedures. This is really where the due process aspect of this would come in. The city would post at least 48-hour advance notice, which would include the following. So it would refer to the SMCs that we already addressed there that would put folks on notice that they are in violation, which is critical for due process requirements. A little further down. And then it would get into what the next steps are with regard to after that 48-hour notice. And then obviously there is no property rights in contraband or litter or other solid waste removals. So would be removed by, and this is one of the things that would be critical, would it be removed by city personnel or agents thereof? So that could become a sticking point, obviously, in adopting an ordinance. Personal property would be removed and then stored for at least 60 days prior to being disposed. That would comply with the Los Angeles case we talked about. Could be claimed, and we would tell folks where they could claim that. And then obviously any contraband, litter, those types of things would be removed. Any individual who receives a notice under the section whose property removed from the camp has a right to meet with the city manager. This is where we really also put in a due process step so that folks have a what we call a meaningful right to be heard, so that if they felt that the ordinance was improperly enforced, they would have an ability to have that redressed. And that was critical with regard to the Ninth Circuit cases. They wanted to make sure that folks had an ability to essentially argue their case, to have some kind of impartial, that they would be able to argue their case, do something about it. And then finally, penalty for violations would be violation would be a misdemeanor, punishable by up to $1,000 fine and up to 90 days in jail. And then the catch-all at the very bottom, which is except as otherwise provided in this section, enforcement of provisions of this chapter shall be suspended for persons who are indigent and homeless anytime there is no space or beds available in reasonable accessible homeless shelters to the extent such space is required by law. So currently that is required by law. That might not always be the case. So yeah, so we thought this was just a kind of a good first kind of stab at this, and feel like it's pretty comprehensive. There may be a few things that we want to tweak to fit council's concerns, but it really is, we thought, a good starting point.
Okay, thank you. It sounds like most council wanted to have us move forward with something like this. It sounds like you guys already got the ball rolling in it, so that's great. And unless there's something else council wants to ask or add to this draft, it sounds like we can move this forward to one of our agenda items, Mr. Casey, for additional comments or first reading. I'm not sure what the process might be for this item, but something we could do forward in the future.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
Mr. Mayor?
Councilor Farmer, yes, go ahead.
What happens if one of the homeless slips and breaks a leg on the parking lot, who's liable for it? Does that become a city problem, or even if they fall and hit their head and they knock unconscious and need hospitalization for a month, who's liable for that?
That's a good question, Mr. Ferguson. What's your take on that?
Sure. Well, I'm going to unfortunately have to give you the infamous. It depends. If somebody is, they would be. That's why I would get nervous about the encampment issue, because one of the things that you want to be clear about with premises liability, which is Councilor Strum was referring to, which is you identify. The first thing you have to do is identify the person who is on the premises. So you have to identify, is that person a trespasser, a licensee, or an invitee? And so once you identify what the person is on the property, then the standard of care for each of those is different. Obviously, trespasser has the least amount of care. You just can't intentionally inflict harm on them. Licensee is ordinary care for the use of the particular facility. Business invitee, now that starts to get really complicated, and that's why you want to be very careful that you're not creating a situation where you're taking money or you're letting people rent. That's now an extremely high bar of liability, and you almost folks would disagree with me, but my personal opinion is that you almost need to protect people from themselves at that point on property. So because that's the highest level of care, but that's why we'd want to be really careful. But to answer Councilor Strimler's specific question, I think if somebody is not legally allowed to be there, the law would define them as a trespasser, and they would at a minimum, they might not have anything beyond just reckless. We couldn't recklessly endanger them, or even if they were a licensee and we had knowledge they were there and we let them remain there. We would still be only held to a standard of ordinary care for the facility in the way it's entitled to be used, which essentially means as long as they're using it in the way that someone who would own it would use it, the standard of care would be met. So would we potentially face a claim? Absolutely. And would that have to go through the process? And is there always issues that can come up with defending those claims? Absolutely. And that is why I think you don't want to let these things kind of just go on, with the actual knowledge and not be dealt with, because I think there could be another level of care that you could be creating. But no, I'm not. I don't think that we have a situation where we're currently overly exposed from an insurance standpoint or liability standpoint, I should say.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Deputy Mayor, did that answer your question?
Not totally. He made the comment that I believe I caught that he said they're basically trespassing and don't really expect a higher level of care if they're trespassing or they're not trespassing. If they're entitled to be there, then they're not trespassing, and I think we become liable if we say, yeah, you can stay here.
Well, and I want to be clear, because it is kind of confusing, but from a civil liability standpoint, the term trespasser is used a little different than in the criminal setting. So it's related to whether someone's there without permission. Doesn't mean that they necessarily that you have some obligation or duty to run them off, but it's essentially why folks have no trespassing signs, because then they know once those signs are posted, they don't have to actively pursue folks getting off their property without being held liable. So I guess to answer your question, I would always want to hedge my bets, but I think we would be in pretty good shape because people clearly don't have permission to be there from an authority source that would allow them to be on that premises. So I think they would be I would think the law would define them as trespassers.
All right, Deputy Mayor, did that clear up a little bit, your question?
I think that probably as good as it's going to get for an answer, yes.
All right. Well,
that's why people love lawyers.
Yeah. All right, thank you for that. Okay, so it sounds like the ordinance is moving forward, and we'll just look forward to seeing that again in the future, and we'll keep it in one of our agenda items. It sounds like most council is in favor of doing something about this. It sounds like the ordinance is the best approach that we have in our as far as a tool to get this somewhat under control. So Okay, we'll move on to our next agenda item. Mr. City Manager, do you want to, is Mr. Ferguson gonna stay for the next agenda item, the outdoor dining, restroom, and COVID-19 code requirements, or is he excused? I think you're muted, Mr. Casey.
Mr. Mayor? Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Deputy Mayor?
I'm the one that requested this item on the agenda. I think I should be allowed to say what this is about.
You will be. I'm just asking Mr. Casey if our city attorney is expected to stay or if he can be excused.
Okay.
Mr. Casey?
So Eric, there were some questions related to code enforcement and code application. We do have Mike Shuttleworth, who's the planning supervisor, who's on the call. So unless you have a real burning desire,
You want me to stay? I'm happy to stay, or whatever works.
I think you can be excused at this point.
Mr. Mayor.
Oh.
I'm sorry, Mr. City Mayor.
Mr. Risucci, go ahead.
Go ahead.
If the deputy mayor is going to introduce something that has legal questions, I would prefer to have the attorney stay here.
Okay.
All right. Sounds like you are expected to stay, Mr. Ferguson. Thank you for volunteering to stay. All right. Well, okay, Mr. Deputy. Oh, actually, we'll have our city manager do the intro, and then we'll start with the Deputy Mayor Stremler on this agenda item.
Okay. As the Deputy Mayor mentioned, he had requested this item last week. This question arose around outdoor dining and restrooms requirements in the current environment of COVID-19 restrictions and state building codes and county health code requirements. And so we wanted, had agreed to, and put that on the agenda as an opportunity for discussion and so forth. We had provided some information to council about a specific circumstance involving a particular business that had come up recently. And so I shared that with council on Friday in your weekly brief.
Thank you, Mr. Casey. Okay. Deputy Mayor Strimmer, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor. This involves a business at 520 South 5th Street. He's been in business, I'm not sure how long, but he is an existing business. He's been a takeout business, and he also has had outside seating for some time. I would say back probably a year or so. And he's got, there's kind of two projects that he's trying to do. One is make an inside dining area, in which case the restrooms would be operational and usable by the public, and this would be after we enter phase 4 of our shutdown. And then the other phase is he has some outside seating areas where people can sit and eat, and he wants to put a roof over that area. He has put up a fence. The city has told him he can put the fence up, and he has put the fence up. And now the city is telling him that he cannot have outside seating unless he has bathroom facilities. And the reason is because he is requesting on-site dining, which his request is for the inside, because he's been doing it on the outside. But the city is refusing him to let him operate, at least part of the sit-down eating outside, unless the bathrooms are ready to use, but they cannot use the bathrooms under phase 4, under phase 1, 2, and 3, really. And it's creating a situation for him where he's fighting with the city that they won't let him move forward, and at the same time he can't have usable bathrooms inside because that's prohibited, and he's in a catch-22, and the city refuses to back down. And I want to have a discussion on that with the council and what's going on here, why he's being discriminated against. It appears he's been discriminated against. We have driven down YVH today. We counted 8 food trucks that had outside seating. None of them had restrooms. Some existing restaurants have provided outside seating. They have restrooms inside, but the public can't use them. So basically, they don't have restrooms, and yet he has been being denied until he has his restrooms operational because the city claims it's a change of type of business he is doing. And so that's all I have for right now, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, Mr. Casey, do you want to have Mr. Shuttleworth kind of explain a little bit about the email that the exchange back and forth, or is that something you want to hold off a little bit on?
This might be a good time, appropriate time for that. I'll just give Mike a moment to get back on the line or come on the line. We are and have been working with this business owner for some time now, trying to navigate both the use that he's putting the building to. There's also other parties involved that have been part of these conversations. There's a separate building owner who leases the portion of the building space to the tenant business. There's a contractor who was involved, has been involved in this process, and there's also an architect. And so Mr. Shuttleworth, since he's been aboard since June, has been working on this as well. And we're obligated to follow health codes for fixed site businesses, restaurants, and so forth. This is what this would meet the definition of. And so that's what they're trying to apply and work with them. And they have, we have recognized that while he's in construction of interior restrooms, that there may need to be an accommodation for the outside space. We've been open to that and have said so. We also know that under the governor's orders, which have been evolving fairly extensively over the last few months, and we've had a number of different adjustments and refinements, and some orders that have scaled things back from where they were before. And I know just Friday, some new clarification around the operations of restaurants were issued that clarified, among other things, that diners, since they were closing down inside dining again in many of these phase 2 and phase 3 open restaurants, that didn't mean they couldn't still take patrons through the restaurant interior to get to the outside dining space or to a restroom that was inside. So there's a number of complexities, and with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Shuttleworth to kind of elaborate on the specifics of the code and how we've been applying it.
Okay, thank you, City Manager. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Basically, we've been working with the business owner and the property owner, their engineer, their architect. We had the fire marshal there, the building official there, and myself met with them last week to discuss the issue. With the relationship to the bathrooms, the building code says that bathrooms are required for any kind of a restaurant business. And there is an exception. The exception is for takeout business where people just come and pick it up and leave basically, or if they're setting it, it's limited to 3 square feet. I can't speak to whether this particular business has been having outside seating for the last year or not. I've only been with the city for 2 months and been working with the individual about that length of time. Not only is the city requirement or the building code, which is a state building code requirement, the health district also has a requirement for bathrooms that are accessible to the patrons of the business. So we're not the only ones that are looking at this. With this particular individual, they are planning to remodel the existing structure because it currently is not being used inside for seating as a restaurant. It was previously, I understand, as a meat market type facility. So there are some major changes that need to be done inside to provide seatings, and the bathrooms will be required to start with that. In the interim, what they're proposing, and I talked to their architect today is having portable toilets outside so they can open up and be functional and meet the requirements of the code. And then in the next 6 months to a year, they will remodel the inside and provide bathrooms in there. So that's my comments, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Mayor, may I make a couple comments?
Mr. Mayor, you.
Yep, I was muted. Thank you. I just noticed it. Thank you, Mr. Shuttleworth, for that, with those comments. And yeah, Mr. Deputy Mayor, please go ahead.
Okay. If you're going to require him to do this, then this has to apply to all the food trucks and the other restaurants that are have outside seating at the present time and do not have restrooms. But then the other issue is, other thing that bothers me is other cities are encouraging outside dining. They do not have porta potties outside, and the inside is closed to the public. So they're in the same boat as we are, and yet we're trying to force something onto one individual that nobody in our city or other cities are having to follow. That's kind of into these two comments.
I'll try to speak to that and invite Mike Shuttleworth to elaborate. Food trucks are regulated under different codes, different portion of the code. They are not required to offer restrooms at their place of business because they are essentially a take and go or short stay. There are some food trucks that we are aware of that have tried to offer a little bit of space around them, but generally they're regulated in such a way that they are supposed to be kind of primarily takeout in focus, and so aren't required to have their own on-site restrooms. In some other cities, yes, we are aware, and we certainly encourage that too. We, Council will recall that in the emergency declaration and last resolution that last two resolutions in May and then again in July that we adopted, we actually relaxed a provision of our current code regulating restaurants and cafe spaces because we recognize that sometimes under the current code, you're restricted to being able to offer outdoor seating immediately adjacent to the front of your business. And we saw that as an opportunity to relax that and allow outdoor seating to expand along the sidewalk, perhaps in front of other neighboring businesses, so that a restaurant or a cafe could actually meet the physical distancing requirements and provide enough seating to be able to, make it viable. So we are trying to work with things like that, with options like that for businesses, and provide outdoor seating. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the governor's office has clarified that restaurants are, if there is a functioning internal restroom for a restaurant business, even though their indoor dining area is closed, they are permitted to allow patrons to go through the interior space in order to access those restrooms. So that clarification, I believe, was just issued last week. And so we would be following that as well.
Deputy Mayor Strimler, any additional questions, comments?
No, I'd like other council members to comment, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have Councillor Hicks. Questions or comments on this discussion item?
No comments at this time.
Thank you. Councillor Boersma.
Well, you guys, I had a whole list of questions that I was going to ask, and through this course of this conversation, you've managed to answer all of them. So well done on that. But I have spoken with the business owner in question, and I would like to see this resolved. I know there's a way forward. It may take some flexibility on both sides, but I've said it to others before. I'm looking for solutions. I understand problems tend to crop up, but let's find a solution to the problems so that these folks can get their business up and running and have this outdoor seating. I mean, just kitty corner from there, Varietal has outdoor seating. If we can make it happen there, we can certainly make it happen in other places and encourage these businesses. So yeah, I'd like to see something resolved here.
Thank you. Councillor Restucci.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd have to echo my sentiment or the sentiments of Councilor Broersma. I understand that we want to fix these things, but at the same time, I'm concerned that council's getting into the weeds. We're a board of directors of a $30 million annual corporation. Our job is to set policy. And when it comes to these type of things, these are administrative functions of the city and should remain under the city manager's purview until a time when council needs to be involved, as in the case of possible litigation or a policy change that needs to come before council. I'm not quite sure that this rises to that yet. But I would be willing to look at a solution if council wants to bring something forward.
Thank you. Up next, we have Councilor Henry.
The only thing I'd like to say is that we are in a pandemic and this isn't forever. This is just kind of a temporary thing. So I almost feel like as a community, it's important to try and keep these places open because a lot of us are losing jobs and money, and these guys are trying really hard to make it. So at the time, that's all I really got. Thank you.
Thank you. Up next, we have Councilor Farmer.
You know, it's no secret among contractors and builders and developers in this city that we are hard to do business with. It's been brought up several times, and I think this is just another example of hard to do business with. I think we're in special circumstances. I think he's a valued member of the community who wants just what everybody else to have is a good, solid business, and it looks like I have seen several emails and I've been involved in several conversations, and I'm appalled of what I have seen and what I have heard. I think we need. I don't want to say we have to go against the law, but you know, there's always a way to do it, and I think instead of saying, "Hey, let's help you get it done," it's let's say, "Well, you have to do this," and then after he does this, well, now we're going to make you do this, and then after he does that, well, maybe we ought to do it this way, and I think this particular merchant has had his chain yanked enough. I'm sorry I have to say it this way, but I think we need to do everything we can to help this merchant get his business up and going. He's not asking for anything more than any other business in this town already gets to do. And that's really what I have to say for right now.
Thank you. And I kind of agree with Councilor Stucci that we are really getting into the weeds with just one business. Our job is not to be advocating for one business or another. Our business is citywide, you know, all businesses. And I know that this would affect other businesses, and having porta potties, it just brings back an image of no wash hand station, for example, and having COVID all over the place. It's just one more place for us to expose our citizens to potentially, you know, infectious disease that it's obviously killing a bunch of people around the state and the country. So I hope when we do that, we are obviously talking about having hand washing stations, sanitation stations, and I'm thinking they have to have a plan, which I remember as part of the requirement of sanitizing common areas and different things. So I really do feel like I put this on the agenda because obviously it's important to the deputy mayor that we talk about this, but I really was apprehensive because we're pointing out a single business, which is not our job. Policy is not just one business. It's all the business in town. And at this point, I don't disagree with anybody as far as the business being important. We want to help them. But if we're going to be bending the rules every single time somebody complains to us, we are going to be in deep trouble because that's all we're going to be doing, just discussing, you know, petty stuff that may not be rise to the level of council involvement. In this case, we just chose to, you know, get in there in the weeds in a sense, as Ristucci mentioned. So obviously, I'm on the fence on this. Honestly, I do want business to succeed. I know we're in the pandemic. People are struggling. But I don't feel like we want to bend the rules to the point that we might potentially get somebody exposed to COVID or other hazardous situations in a place like this. So yeah, it's a tough one. But at this point, I think we talked about this enough, and I think the city manager has somewhat of an idea how council feels about this topic. And it sounds like the consensus is we want to work with this individual and see what we can do. Obviously, staying within the confinements of the law without breaking that. So if council has other comments, this is the time to speak up, and we'll get those addressed, hopefully.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, sir.
I think, and I understand what you're saying, and I don't disagree with you, but I think part of the question here is not so much bending the rules, but rather making sure that everybody understands what those rules are and that those rules be consistent. It sounds like for this individual, things have changed over time. When they said you have to do one thing, he would try to comply. And the next time they say, well, no, now you have to do this. So the rules are being modified for him as he moves along, and the frustration was mounting. And so as council, I think it's part of our job to make sure that there's consistency across the board, because one of our roles is to support the businesses and the people in this town. And if they're being constantly confused and feel like they're being run around by rule changes, then they're going to be frustrated. And so that is part of our role. I understand our main role is managing this corporation that is the city of Sunnyside, but we do also have a role to support the citizens in this town. And this, I think, at this point does rise to that. I don't know that we need to do a lot more other than to see that something is being done, but to bring this sort of thing up is, I think, part of our role.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, this is Councilor Farmer again. I could not agree with Councilor Boersma anymore. I was elected to represent the people and the businesses of this town. And I think that I would be amiss in not bringing this kind of stuff forward. It's terrible that we have to do it this way, but sometimes that's the way it has to be done. And I think we owe this merchant and any other merchant, and there's been other merchants in this town that have gone through the same thing. It just hasn't been brought out in public. And I think that if we don't stand behind the citizens and the merchants of this town, I'm not saying we have to do anything illegal. I'm saying there's always a way to do things, and I don't think we look hard enough for other ways to solve the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional council members?
This is Councilor Stremler.
Go ahead, sir.
I agree with Mr. Farmer. There's always an answer, but we have to dig for it. And I agree. The city's just not digging for it. They keep changing the rules as they go along, or don't inform them of the rules until it's almost too late. And they keep getting informed of new rules over months. This has been going. The project started probably half a year ago or so, and things keep changing. This is not the only thing. He's had other issues that the rules keep changing inside the building as well, and he's getting very fed up. And this is why he's reached out for a voice to express his frustrations with the city, and that's exactly what we're doing. And it's bad it has to come to this, but it is. This is where we're at. That's all I have.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Mayor?
Yes, sir.
One quick question to my fellow council member, the deputy mayor. Why has it come to this? My question is, have you tried to work with the city manager's office before bringing this to council? And if you did you not get the answers that you wanted? Thank you.
I have come to you with other issues that I never got answers to, yes. And on this, he had, I'll run the next issue by you then. This happened several months ago. He was told there was an existing wall inside that had a hood system on it. He was going to put in a new hood system, and he was told he had to put in a new wall. Actually, the people putting in the hood system were told they had to have a new wall 18 inches from the existing wall. So they built the new wall, put in the new hood system, cut a new hole through the roof. And then when they come back to inspect it, oh, well, you really didn't have to do that. Now he's got other problems that may not have passed the health district now because there's a cavity that he can't get in to clean. It can create a problem for the fire department because when you're feeling along the walls coming in on a fire, you can run into an 18-inch dead space and not be able to get out, or not know how to get out. It's probably a better way to word it. We've created other issues, and this is the kind of stuff that goes on all the time. And I've talked to you when you first came here, Mr. Farmer, at our recent meeting with Mr. Bushman and me. He said he had talked to you about these kind of issues. Mr. Bushman at that same meeting told you he had talked to you about these issues. So you've been talked to about issues with the planning department, and nothing ever happens. That's my take on it. It's become futile to even talk to you because it's like talking to a wall is what it seems like to me.
All right, Mr. Deputy Mayor, so we'll keep it civilized, but at the end of the day, yes, so obviously Mr. Casey is he's in charge of all of our city staff, and obviously he has the discretion of telling them what to do. We obviously have our city manager who we can voice our concerns and opinions of how the city should be ran, but that's just going to be it unless the body of the whole makes a decision. Then at this point, the city manager has discretion on how to operate the city itself. So at the end of the day, obviously we do want to make sure that this business gets clarity on what needs to happen in order for him to move forward with this business. It sounds like there's some miscommunication or some training needed because it sounds, sounds like there's a lot of misguidance, maybe. I'm not sure what the proper word would be. But again, I'm not privy to the conversation, so I'm not quite sure what the reasons were. But Mr. City Manager, also, you heard quite a few of these comments today, so hopefully you take those into consideration when making decisions as far as, what needs to happen there for this business to be able to continue operating.
Yes, certainly. And, Mr. Strimler and Councilor Strimler, Councilor Farmer, and Councilor Boersma did come in to meet, I believe it was around July 8th, brought this issue to my attention specifically around the concerns with the experience that this business had had, as well as others. I met that week with the planning supervisor, and we've been taking a keen interest in this, and that's within the scope of and within the structure of both the codes and the laws that we have to enforce and apply consistently. And I think we have an absolute shared commitment to ensuring that the laws and rules and codes are applied consistently and both consistently and flexibly. And we are, as Mr. Shuttleworth expressed earlier, he has taken a direct interest and involvement in working to try to bring all of the various issues to resolution here, and that's the path we're still on, is working to bring resolution and positive solution forward, and we'll continue to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Casey. Okay, any last comments from council members? So move on to our within our agenda. Okay, I think this is a good time to, Mr. Ferguson, I don't believe you need to be for our council meeting, so thank you for joining us and staying for our discussion, and we'll talk to you next time.
Mr. Mayor. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric. Mr. Mayor?
Yes, sir.
I'd like to make one more statement real quick on this item. I understand the concerns of council wanting to advocate on behalf of the citizens. For 16.5 years, I've been doing that on behalf of the citizens, but I don't necessarily bring that to council's attention. The idea is to work with the manager's office and get things worked out before they come to council. I have concerns here that 3 members of council met with the manager to discuss an issue with a citizen, and council wasn't made aware of that. If we're going to do this right, folks, then we need to communicate. All of us need to be on the same sheet of music. There were items that were introduced here tonight that I knew nothing about. And I think that puts council at a disadvantage, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you for those comments, Mr. Restucci. Obviously, it's something that it's obviously tough for some of us to kind of not try to guide our city manager to do things that are important to us. But I think all of us know that the only time we can really tell a city manager what to do is when at least the majority of council agrees on a subject matter. So I think there's no confusion on that part. But obviously we do have some items that are important to each of us individually, and we do address it with the city manager. And at that point, he will bring it to the whole council to make a decision. So I think we're on the same page as that one, Mr. Restucci.
Mr. Mayor, this is Councilor Farmer again. I could not agree with my seatmate, Councilor Restucci. Anything you know, I should know. Anything I know, everybody else in this council should know. It is not happening. There's several things that get brought up that I know absolutely nothing about, and it bothers me. Matter of fact, when I first came on council, that was one thing that I talked to the city manager about, that if it was good enough for somebody else to know, it was good enough for me to know. And I think the council can make a much better decision and can be much more informed and act much more as a body if we all are on the same page and we all have been given the same information or given the information. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, okay, well, we'll just move forward. We'll leave this alone already because we could keep going all night discussing this, but we'll move on to our next item, which is our upcoming council meetings. Mr. City Manager.
And as a point of if I may ask for a point of clarification on that, individual council members have issued points of inquiry periodically. I do try to include those in as much as I, am able in the weekly briefs or other updates to council. I have not made necessarily a practice of notifying council every time any individual council member or subgroup of council contacts me on a topic, and I can certainly do that if that's will be helpful, and what the do that going forward. Agenda planning schedule. The next meeting coming up on Monday is the Department of Ecology Airport Cleanup Grant. I'll ask Director Fisher to give you a quick preview of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, the cleanup grant, that's the Department of Ecology, and we're still waiting for them to do their internal audit on that grant before it gets released to us. And basically, the cleanup grant is obviously for the pesticide cleanup that we've been trying to get cleaned up for about 10 years now. So we actually are at the point where we're ready to actually start removing soil. So once we get the grant in place, and we'll obviously bring it to council on the 10th if it's ready, and we'll go through all the finer details of that grant and exactly what it's going to take to get the airport cleaned up.
Okay. And then the next item, Planning Commission requested of the planning supervisor to bring forward to council an amendment to the code that governs their meeting time. Mr. Shuttleworth, do you want to say a few words about that?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, the Planning Commission has requested that their meeting time be changed from 6:30 to 5:30. And that was by a vote of the Planning Commission. So I am bringing forward their request.
Okay. On August 24th, we anticipate being able to brief council and potentially take action either there or at a meeting in September relative to the Transportation Benefit District Sales and Use Tax ballot proposition. Election results will be certified on August 18th. And so the city attorney is working or will soon be working on a draft resolution or ordinance putting into effect council's action if in fact the ballot proposition passes tomorrow. And so that would be the final step in enacting the sales and use tax increase, if, again, assuming the voters grant council authorization to do so in the ballot initiative. And in between there, I'll mention that we anticipate on August 15th, that'll be the date we most like that we are aiming to set the budget 2021 budget kickoff workshop. We are working on the logistics of that at this time, and anticipate about a two-step workshop, morning session in which we go over setting the stage for budget background, the history of finances last decade or so, current debt limit, recent state audits, and so forth, and then break for a lunch period, and then turning attention to kind of preliminary future estimates of expenditures for 2021, as well as an updated review of potential revenue forecasts for 2021. The MRSC, Municipal Research Services Center, just released a new budgeting guide and revenue section, and in that they largely said, stay tuned. It's highly unpredictable what revenues are going to be for municipalities in 2021. And they gave a number of links to websites like the State Revenue Forecast Council and Department of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and so forth, and said, just keep checking in those, and hopefully they'll be able to clarify the picture a little bit as you enter, head into the heart of budgeting in October. So we'll see how good our crystal ball turns out to be. Tuesday, September 8th, we are shifted a day because of the Labor Day holiday. We've tentatively put in there kind of a study session on the statutory framework for development impact fees. This was a topic that kind of by consensus, a majority of the council had indicated an interest in at a recent meeting. Mr. Shuttleworth will be preparing that. And I think that's about it as far as scheduled items. We do currently have on there for October the Transportation Improvement Board fuel tax agreement. This is on the Midvale Road project. That also currently is tied in with the Transportation Benefit District proposition, but we have to commit to the TIB by the end of November, right around Thanksgiving, whether we're going to sign on for that project for 21 and 22. And so we'll be bringing that. We've got that already kind of placed there on the agenda. As you can see, there's a number of other topics and activities coming ahead. Most of these are flexible in terms of their timing, and we're kind of working on getting them queued up as the workload allows. I did also want to update council that I had a good conversation today with officials at Yakima County. This is related to a topic that may come to council again in the future, which is the Community Development Block Grant, CV1 grant program, which is one of several that we're currently tracking. The CV1 program is the one that the Department of Commerce is administering through essentially a series of county-led consortiums. And the focus will be disbursement of funds through these consortiums to be able to do assistance to low-income individuals, things like help with utility payments or mortgage payments, help with micro businesses and so forth. There is an option to opt out, but it expires this Friday. And if a city opts out, then that cuts the amount of allotment that the county would get, and it would oblige the city to come up with its own program and infrastructure and administration of it. Right now, Yakima County is planning to go forward with the assumption that all of the cities in the valley will remain opted in, and they'll be required to essentially run a process whereby each city has an opportunity to provide input and to facilitate among its own community members input into the selection of projects and activities and how the funds will be dispersed in their own community. It's not a huge amount of money. It's about, I think, let's see, I got it up over here. It's about $875,000 countywide. Largest share goes to Yakima County at about $330,000. Then the other cities, this does not include City of Yakima. I think Sunnyside's allocation is about $130,000. And so we've got that update from county officials today. And so there may be an opportunity, or there'll be an opportunity later for council and for community members to weigh in on the kinds of activities that are funded through that. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions about the future agendas.
Council members, questions on our agenda items?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor.
Yes, Deputy Boersma, go ahead.
Yeah, so I know I had indicated that the 5th would be a much better day for me for our budget retreat. I will endeavor to participate as much as possible. The only struggle is I will be required to do so via my phone on the 15th as opposed to on a computer where I can look at documents fully. Is there a way I can get all the documents printed before the meeting so that I can follow along?
Yes, our intention is council members who were part of the process last year may remember that staff provided binders with all of the materials at the first meeting, and our intent is to update those and essentially provide those binders to council in advance this time. Much of what we'll be preparing is a refresh of information from last year's budget workshop, and so we're aiming to try to get those out 2 to 3 days ahead so that you have a time to review all the materials in advance.
Mr. Mayor, Councilor Hicks.
Yes, sir, go ahead.
If it is the 15th, we are doing a soft opening of the casino the 13th. I'm not sure if I will be free.
Okay, thank you. You still get the materials, and if you are available, then we would love to have your input on the items that we'll be talking about that day.
Yeah, I would love the materials just to go over it.
Excellent, thank you. Anyone else, any other questions about the agendas items?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, one item.
Yes, sir.
Just let Jackie know and council know that I contacted Yakima County this morning, and jury trials have been canceled until September, so I don't have jury duty, so I can definitely attend either day that council wants to choose for the retreat. And also, I wanted to let you know that at the next regular meeting, I will have a small update on 5G. The FCC just did a ruling recently that made changes to the Federal Spectrum Act and is moving. It's real slow, but we're getting somewhere. So I'll have a report for council at the next meeting.
Thank you. Additional council members? Okay, the time is 8:19. There being no business come before council, and without objection, I will adjourn this meeting at 8:19 p.m. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.